Good to know she had at least one friend among the Aes Sedai who had come to Fal Dara. The light illumine you. Liandrin's mouth tightened, and she gave her shawl a twitch. The Amyrlin seat. She requires your presence, sister. Her voice was petulant, too, and cold-edged. Not for Moiraine's sake, or not solely. Liandrin always sounded dissatisfied with something. Frowning, she tried to look over Moiraine's shoulder into the room. This chamber, it is warded. We cannot enter. Why do you ward against your sisters? Against all, Moiraine replied smoothly. Many of the serving women are curious about Aes Sedai, and I do not want them pawing through my rooms when I am not here. There was no need to make a distinction until now. She pulled the door shut behind her, leaving all three of them in the corridor. Shall we go? We must not keep the Amyrlin waiting. She started down the hallway with Anaya chatting at her side. Liandrin stood for a moment staring at the door as if wondering what Moiraine was hiding, then hurried to join the others. She bracketed Moiraine, walking as stiffly as a guard. Anaya merely walked, keeping company. Their slippered footsteps fell softly on thick-woven carpets with simple patterns. Liveried women curtsied deeply as they passed, many more deeply than they would have for the Lord of Fal Dara himself. Aes Sedai, three together, and the Amyrlin seat herself in the keep. It was more honor than any woman of the keep had ever expected in her lifetime. A few women of noble houses were out in the halls, and they curtsied too, which they most certainly would not have done for Lord Agilmar. Moiraine and Anaya smiled and bowed their heads to acknowledge each reverence, from servant or noble equally. Liandrin ignored them all. There were only women here, of course, no men. No Shienaran male above the age of 10 would enter the women's rooms without permission or invitation, although a few small boys ran and played in the halls here. They knelt on one knee, awkwardly, when their sisters dropped deep curtsies. Now and then, Anaya smiled and ruffled a small
Hey,
head
Noda,
as
how
she
you
passed.
doing?
This time, Moiraine, Anaya said,
Have you heard from
You have been
Trizit?
gone from Tar Valon too long. Much too long. Tar Valon misses you, your sisters miss you, and you are needed in the White Tower. Some of us must work in the world, Moiraine said gently. I will leave the hall of the tower to you, Anaya. Yet in Tar Valon, you hear more of what occurs in the world than I. Too often I outrun what happens where I was yesterday. What news have you? 3 more false dragons. Liandrin bit the words off. In Saldaea, Morandi, and Tyr, false dragons ravage the land. The while you blues smile and talk of nothing, and try to hold on to the past. Anaya raised an eyebrow, and Liandrin snapped her mouth shut with a sharp sniff. 3, Moiraine mused softly. For an instant, her eyes gleamed, but
I
she
hope
masked
everyone's
it
doing
quickly.
good today.
3 in the last 2 years, and now 3 more at once. As the others were, these will be dealt with also. This male vermin and any ragtag rabble who follow their banners. Moiraine was almost amused by the certainty in Liandrin's voice. Almost. She was too aware of the realities, too aware of the possibilities. Have a few months been enough for you to forget, sister? The last false dragon all but tore Gildan apart before his army, ragtag, rabble or not, was defeated. Yes, Loghain is in Tar Valon by now, gentled and safe, I suppose, but some of our sisters died to overpower him. Even one sister dead is more loss than we can bear.
Had the wrong one on. My bad, guys.
500 of the maidens behind Sulin accompanied Rand back to the royal palace, where Bael waited in the great court inside the front gates with Thunderwalkers and Black Eyes and Water Seekers, and men from every other society. Their numbers filling the courtyard and crowding back into the palace through every door down to the smallest servant's way. Some watched from lower windows, waiting their turn to come out. The surrounding stone balconies were empty. In the entire courtyard, only one man waited who was not Aiel. Tyrans and Cairhienin, especially Cairhienin, stayed clear when Aiel gathered. The exception stood above Bael on the wide gray steps leading into the place. Heaven, with the crimson banner hanging limply from its staff, and no more expression surrounded by Aiel than at any other time. Avienda, behind Rand's saddle, clung tightly to him, breasts pressed against his back until the very moment he dismounted. There had been an exchange between her and some of the wise ones back at the docks that he did not think he had been supposed to hear. "Go with the light," Amis had said, touching Avienda's face, "and guard him closely. You know how much depends on him." "Much depends on you both," Bear told Avienda, almost at the same time that Mullane said irritably, "It would be easier if you had succeeded by now." Soralea snorted. "Even maidens knew how to handle men in my day." "She has been more successful than you know," Amis told them. Avienda shook her head. The Roses and Thorns ivory bracelet slid down her arm as she raised a hand to forestall the other woman, but Amis went on over her half-formed protests. "I have waited for her to tell us, but since she will not..." She saw him then, standing only 10 feet away, with Jodden's reins in his hand, and cut off sharply. Avienda turned to see what Amis was staring at. When her eyes found him, bright crimson suffused her face, then drained away so suddenly that even her sun-dark cheeks looked pale. The four wise ones fixed him with flat, unreadable gazes. Osmoda and Matt came up behind him, leading their horses. "Do women learn that look in the cradle?" Matt muttered. "Do their mothers teach them? I'd say the mighty Kara Karn will get his ears singed if he stays around here much longer." Shaking his head, Rand reached up as Avienda swung a leg over to slide down, and lifted her from the dapple's back. For a moment, he held her by the waist, looking down into her clear blue-green eyes. She did not look away, and her expression never changed, but her hands tightened slowly on his forearms. What success was she supposed to have? He had thought she was sent to spy on him for the Wise Ones, but if she ever asked a question about things he held back from the Wise Ones, it was in open anger at him for keeping secrets from them. Never slyly, never trying to figure something out. Bludgeon, maybe, but never fair. He had considered the possibility that she was like one of Colaver's young women, but only for the brief moment it took to think of the notion. Avienda would never let herself be used in that way. Besides, even if she had, giving him one taste of herself, then denying him so much as a kiss afterward, not to mention making him chase her halfway around the world, was no way to go about it. If she was more than casual about being naked in front of him, Aiel customs were different. If his distress at it satisfied her, likely it was because she thought it was a great joke to play on him. So what was she supposed to be successful at? Plots all around him. Was everyone scheming? He could see his face in her eyes. Who had given her that silver necklace? "I like canoodling as much as the next man," Matt said. "But don't you think there are a few too many people watching?" Rand released Avienda's waist and stepped back, but no more quickly than she. She bent her head, fussing with her skirt, muttering about how riding had disarrayed it, but not before he saw her cheeks redden. Well, he had not meant to embarrass her. Scowling around the courtyard, he said, "I told you I don't know how many I can take, Bale." With the maidens spilling back through the gates onto the right, there was barely room to move in the courtyard. 500 from each society meant 6,000 Aiel. The hallways inside must be packed. The towering Aiel chief shrugged. Like every other Aiel there, he had his shupa wrapped around his head, ready to veil. No crimson headband, though it seemed at least half the others wore the black and white disc on their foreheads. "Every spear that can follow you will. Will the two Aes Sedai come soon?" No. It was good that Avienda kept her promise not to let him touch her again. Lanfear had tried to kill her and Egwene because she did not know which was Avienda. How had Kadir found out to tell her? No matter. Lan was right. Women found pain or death when they came too close to him. They will not be coming. There are stories of trouble by the river. A great victory, Bale, Rand said wearily, and much honor earned. But not by me. Peven came down past Bale to stand behind Rand's shoulder, with the banner, his narrow, scarred face absolutely blank. Does the whole palace know about this, then? Rand asked. I heard, Peven said. His jaw worked, chewing for more words. Rand had found him a replacement for his patched country coat. Good red wool, and the man had dragons embroidered on it, one climbing either side of his chest. That you were going somewhere. That seemed to exhaust his store. Rand nodded. Rumors grew in the palace like mushrooms in the shade. But as long as Robin did not find out. He scanned the tile roofs and tower tops. No ravens. He had not seen a raven in some time, though he heard of other men killing them. Perhaps they avoided him now. Stand ready. He seized saidin, floated in emptiness, emotionless. The gateway appeared at the foot of the steps, first a bright line that seemed to turn, opening into a square hole into blackness 4 paces wide. Not a murmur came from the Aiel. Those beyond would be able to see him as through a smoked glass, a dusky shimmering in the air. But they could as well try walking through one of the palace walls. From the side, the gateway would be invisible, except to those few close enough to see what might seem a long, fine hair drawn tight. 4 paces was as large as Rand could make it. There were limits for one man by himself, Osmodian claimed. It seemed there were always limits. The amount of saidin you drew did not matter. The one power had little to do with gateways, really. Only the making. Beyond was something else. A dream of a dream, Osmodian called it. He stepped through onto what appeared to be a paving stone lifted from the courtyard. But here, the gray square hung in the midst of utter darkness, with a sense that in every direction there was nothing. Nothing forever. It was not like night. He could see himself and the stone perfectly, but everything else, everywhere else, was blackness. It was time to see how large he could make a platform. With the thought, more stones appeared all at once, duplicating the courtyard to an inch. He imagined it larger still. Then quickly, gray stone stretched as far as he could see. With a start, he realized that his boots were beginning to sink into the stone under his feet. It looked no different, yet it yielded slowly like mud, oozing up around his boots. Hastily, he brought everything back to a square the size of what was outside. That much stayed solid, then began increasing it by one outer row of stones at a time. It did not take long to realize he could not make the platform much larger than his first attempt. The stone still looked all right. It did not sink beneath his feet, but the second added row felt insubstantial, like a thin shell that might crack at a wrong step. Was that because this was as large as the thing could be made? Or because he had not thought of it larger at first? We all make our limits. The thought slid up surprisingly from somewhere. And we set them further out than we have any right. Rand felt himself shiver. In the void, it seemed like feeling someone else shiver. It was well to be reminded that Lews Therin was still inside him. He had to be careful not to fall into a battle for self while confronting Robin. If not for that, he might have... No. What had happened on the quay was done. He would not make a hash of it for breakfast. Reducing the platform by one outer ring of square stones, he turned. Bale was waiting out there in what seemed a huge square doorway into daylight with the steps beyond. At his side, Peven looked no more perturbed by what he saw than the Aiel chief, which was to say, not at all. Peven would carry that banner wherever Rand went, even the pit of doom, and never blink. Matt shoved back his hat to scratch his head, then jerked it low again, muttering something about dice in his head. Impressive, Osmodian said quietly. Quite impressive. Flatter him some other time, Harper, Aviendha said. She was the first to step through, watching Rand, not where she put her feet. She walked all the way to him without once so much as glancing at anything except his face. When she reached him, though, it was to swing away abruptly, settling her shawl over her elbows, and study the darkness. Sometimes, women were stranger than anything else the Creator could possibly have made. Bale and Peven came right behind her, then Osmodian, one hand clutching the strap of his harp case across his chest, the other white-knuckled on his sword hilt. And Matt, swaggering, but a trifle reluctant, and grumbling as if arguing with himself. In the old tongue. Sulin claimed the honor to be first else, but soon a wide stream followed. Not just Maidens of the Spear, but Tyne Shari, True Bloods, and Far Aldazar Din, Brothers of the Eagle, Red Shields and Dawn Runners, Stone Dogs and Knife Hands. Representatives of every society crowding through. As the numbers increased, Rand moved to the far side of the platform from the gateway. There was no need to see where he was going, really, but he wanted to. In truth, he could have remained at the other end or gone to one side. Direction here was mutable. Whatever way he chose to move would take him to Caemlyn if done properly, and to the endless black of nowhere if done wrong. Except for Bale and Sulin, and Aviendha, of course, the Aiel left a little space around him and Matt, Osmodian and Peven. Stay away from the edge, Rand said. The Aiel nearest him moved back all of a foot. He could not see over the forest of Shufa-shrouded heads. Is it full? He called. The thing might hold half those who wanted to go, but not many more. Is it full? Yes, a woman's voice called back finally, reluctantly. He thought it sounded like Lamel. But there was still a milling in the gateway. Aiel sure there must be room for one more. Enough, Rand shouted. No more. Clear the gateway. Everyone stand well clear. He did not want what had happened to the Seanchan spear to happen here to living flesh. A pause, and then... It is clear. It was Lamel. He would have bet his last copper that Inyla and Samara were back there somewhere, too. The gateway seemed to turn sideways, thinning until it vanished with one final flash of light. Blood and ashes, Matt muttered, leaning disgustedly on his spear. This is worse than the Flaming Ways.
Some nice shatter.
Which earned him a startled look from Osmodian, and a considering one from Bale. Matt did not notice. He was too busy glaring at the blackness. There was no sense of motion, no breeze to stir the banner Peven held. They could have been standing still, but Rand knew better. He could almost feel the place they were approaching draw nearer. If you come out too close to him, he will sense it. Osmodian licked his lips and avoided looking at anyone. At least, that is what I have heard. I know where I am going, Rand said. Not too close, but not too far. He remembered the spot well. No movement. Endless black, and them hanging in it. Motionless. Half an hour passed, perhaps. A slight stir ran through the Aiel.
Maybe.
What is it? Rand asked. Murmurs came across the platform. Someone fell, a bulky man near him said at last. Rand recognized him. It was Mekiar. He was Kor Darai, a night spear. He wore the red headband. Not one of the... Rand began, then caught Sulin looking at him flat-eyed. He turned to stare out into the darkness, anger a stain clinging to the emotionless void. So it was not supposed to matter more to him if one of the maidens had fallen, was it? It did. Falling forever through endless black. Would sanity crack before death came? From starvation, or thirst, or fear? In that fall, even an Aiel must eventually find fear strong enough to stop a heart. He almost hoped so. It must be more merciful than the other. Burn me. What happened to all that hardness I was so proud of? A maiden or a stone dog, a spear is a spear. Only thinking it could not make it so. I will be hard. He would let the maidens dance the spears where they wished. He would. And he knew he would search out the name of everyone who died, that every name would be another knife cut on his soul. I will be hard. The light help me, I will. The light help me. Seemingly motionless, hanging in blackness. The platform stopped. It was hard to say how he knew, when he could tell it was moving before, but he did. He channeled, and a gateway opened in the same way it had in the courtyard in Cairhien. The angle of the sun had hardly changed, but here, early morning light shone on a paved street and a rising slope patched brown with drought-killed grass and wildflowers. A slope topped by a stone wall 2 spans high or more, the stones worked rough, so it seemed something natural. Above that wall, he could see the golden domes of the royal palace of Andor, a few of the pale spires topped with banners rippling a white lion on a breeze. On the other side of that wall was the garden where he had first met Elaine. Blue eyes floated accusingly outside the void, the darting memory of kisses stolen in tear, the memory of a letter laying her heart and soul at his feet, of messages borne by Egwene professing love. What would she say if she ever learned about Aviendha, about that night together in the snow hut? Memory of another letter, icily spurning him, a queen condemning a swineherd to outer darkness. It did not matter. Lan was right. But he wanted... what? Who? Blue eyes, and green, and dark brown. Elaine, who maybe loved him, and maybe could not make up her mind. Aviendha, who taunted him with what she would not let him touch. Min, who laughed at him, thought him a wool-headed fool. All that flashed along the boundaries of the void. He tried to ignore it, to ignore anguished memories of another blue-eyed woman, lying dead in a palace corridor so long ago. He had to stand there while Aiel dashed out behind Bael, veiling themselves, spreading left and right. It was his presence that maintained the platform. It would vanish as soon as he stepped through the gateway. Aviendha waited almost as calmly as Pevin, though she did occasionally put her head out to frown faintly in one direction or the other down the street. Asmodean fingered his sword and breathed too quickly. Rand wondered whether the man knew how to use the thing. Not that he would have to. Rand stared up the wall, as though at a bad remembrance. He had entered the palace this way once, too. The last veiled Aiel went by, and Rand motioned the others out, then followed. The gateway winked out of existence, leaving him in the middle of a long circle of wary maidens. Aiel were running down the curving street. It followed the line of the hill. All the streets of the inner city flowed with the land, vanishing around winding corners as they hurried to find and secure anyone who might give alarm. More were climbing the slope, and some had even begun to scale the wall, using tiny knobs and ridges for finger and toe holds. Suddenly Rand stared. To his left, the street bowed downward and rounded out of sight, the decline giving a view past tile-covered towers, sparkling in the morning sun with 100 changing colors, across the tile roofs, all the way to one of the inner city's many parks, its white walks and monuments forming a lion's head when seen from this angle. To his right, the street rose a little before curving away, more towers topped by spires or domes of various shapes glittering above the rooftops. Aiel filled the street, fanning out quickly into side streets that spiraled away from the palace. Aiel, and not a soul else. The sun was high enough for people to be out and about their business, even this close to the palace. Like a nightmare, the wall above toppled outward in half a dozen places, Aiel and stones smashing down on those still climbing. Before those bouncing, sliding chunks of masonry reached the streets, Trollocs appeared in the openings, dropping the tree-thick battering rams they had used, and drawing scythe-curved swords. More, with spiked axes and barbed spears, huge man-shapes in black mail with spikes at shoulders and elbows, huge man-faces distorted by snouts and muzzles, beaks and horns and feathers, plunging down the slope with eyeless Myrddraal like midnight serpents in their midst. All along the street, howling Trollocs and silent Myrddraal poured from doorways, leaped from windows. Lightning stabbed from the cloudless sky. Rand wove fire and air to meet fire and air, a slow-spreading shield racing lightning's fall. Too slow. One bolt struck the shield directly above his head, shattering in a blinding glare. But others grounded themselves, and his hair lifted as the air itself seemed to hammer him down. Almost he lost the weave, almost the void itself. But he wove what he could not see through eyes still filled with coruscating light. Spread the shield against bolts from the heavens that he could at least feel hammering at it. Hammering to reach him, but that could change. Drawing saidin through the angreal in his pocket, he wove the shield until he was sure it must cover half of the inner city, then tied it off. As he pushed himself to his feet, sight began to return, watery and painful at first. He had to move fast. Ravin knew he was here. He had to... Surprisingly little time had passed, seemingly. Ravin had not cared how many of his own he took. Stunned Trollocs and Myrddraal on the slope were falling to spears in the hands of maidens, many of whom moved unsteadily themselves. Some maidens, those nearest Rand, were only now pulling themselves up from where they had been flung, and Peven stood spraddle-legged, holding himself upright with the Red Banner's staff, his scarred face still blank as slate. More Trollocs boiled through the gaps in the wall above, and the din of battle filled the streets in all directions. But it might as well have been in another country so far as Rand was concerned. There had been more than one bolt in that first volley, but not all had been aimed at him. Mat's smoking boots lay a dozen paces from where Mat himself sprawled on his back. Tendrils of smoke rose from the black haft of his spear, too, from his coat, even from the silver backshead hanging out of his shirt that had not saved him from a man's chain. Osmodian was a twisted shape of char, recognizable only from the blackened harp case still strapped to his back. Unmarked, she could have laid down to rest, if she could have rested staring unblinking at the sun. Rand bent to touch her cheek.
No, it was
Cooling
pretty tasty.
already. It felt not like flesh. Ravin! It startled him a little, that sound coming from his throat. He seemed to be sitting somewhere deep in the back of his own head, the void around him vaster, emptier than it had ever been before. saidin raged through him. He did not care if it scoured him away. The taint seeped through everything, tarnished everything. He did not care. 3 Trollocs broke past the maidens, great spiked axes and oddly hooked spears in hairy hands, all 2 human eyes fixing on him, standing there apparently unarmed. The one with a boar's tusked snout went down with Anila's spear through its spine. Eagle's beak and bear's muzzle raced on toward him, one on booted feet, the other on paws. Rand felt himself smile. Fire burst from the Trollocs, a flame at every pore, bursting through black mail. Even as their mouths opened to scream, a gateway opened right where they stood. Bloody fire of burning, cleanly sliced Trollocs fell. Rand was staring through the opening. Not into blackness, but a great columned hall with lion-carved stone panels, where a large man with wings of white in his dark hair started up in surprise from a gilded throne. A dozen men, some dressed as lords, some in breastplates, turned to see what their master was looking at. Rand barely noticed them. "Robin," he said. Or someone did. He was not sure who. Sending fire and lightning ahead of him, he stepped through and let the gateway close behind him. He was death.
Nynaeve was having no trouble maintaining the temper that allowed her to channel a flow of spirit to the amber sleeping woman in her pouch. Even the feel of unseen eyes could not touch her through her anger this morning. Swan stood in front of her on a Salidar street in Tularan, a street empty save for them, a few flies, and one fox that paused to look at them curiously before trotting on. "You must concentrate," Nynaeve barked. "You had more control than this the first time. Concentrate." "I am concentrating, you fool girl." Swan's plain blue wool dress was suddenly silk. The 7-striped stole of the Amerlin seat hung around her neck, and a golden serpent bit its own tail on her finger. Frowning at Nynaeve, she did not seem aware of the change, though she had already worn the same 5 times today. "If there's any difficulty, it lies in that foul-tasting brew you fed me. Faugh! I can still taste it. Like flatfish gall." Stole and ring vanished. The silk dress's high neck plunged low enough to show the twisted stone ring dangling between her breasts on a fine gold chain. "If you didn't insist on me teaching you when you needed something to help you sleep, you wouldn't need it." So there had been a little sheep's tongue root, and a few other things that were not really necessary in the mix. The woman deserved to have her tongue curdled. "You can hardly teach me when you're teaching Shiriam and the others." The silk paled. The neck was high again, surrounded by a white lace ruff, and a cap of pearls fitted close on Swan's hair.
One second, I'll be right back.
"Or would you rather I came after them? You claim you need some sleep undisturbed." Nynaeve quivered, fists clenched at her sides. Shiriam and the others were not the worst things stoking her anger. She and Elaine took turns bringing them to Tel'aran Riyadh 2 at a time, sometimes all 6 in one night. And even if she was the teacher, they never let her forget she was accepted and they Aes Sedai. One sharp word when they made a foolish mistake. Elaine had only been sent to scrub pots once, but Nynaeve's hands were shriveled from hot soapy water. Back where her body lay sleeping they were, anyway. But they were not the worst. Nor was the fact that she barely had a moment to spare for investigating what, if anything, could be done about stilling and gentling. Loghain was more cooperative than Swan and Lyanna in any case, or at least more eager. Thank the light he understood about keeping it secret. Or thought he did. He probably believed she would heal him eventually. No, worse than that was that Pheolin had been tested and raised. Not Aes Sedai, not without the oath rod, which was tight in the tower, but to something more than accepted. Pheolin wore any dress she chose now, and if she could not wear the shawl or choose an Ajah, she had been given other authority. Nynaeve thought she had fetched more cups of water, more books, left deliberately she was sure, more pins and ink jars and other useless things in the last 4 days than she had her entire stay in the tower. Yet even Pheolin was not the worst of all. She did not even want to remember that. Her anger could have heated a house in winter. "What's put a hook in your gills today, girl?" Swan had on a gown like those Lyanna wore, only more sheer than even Lyanna would ever wear in public, so thin it was hard to tell what color it was. Not the first time she had had that on today, either. What was perking around in the back of the woman's mind? In the world of dreams, things like these changes of clothing betrayed thoughts you might not even know you had. "You have been almost decent company until today," Swan continued irritably, then paused. "Until today. I see it now. Yesterday afternoon, Shiriam assigned Theodrin to begin helping you break down that block you've built up. Is that what has your shift in a twist? You don't like Theodrin telling you what to do? She's a wilder too, girl. If anyone can help you learn to channel without eating nettles first, she... And what has you so jittery you can't hold your dress still? Theodrin. That was what really hurt. The failure. Maybe it's something I heard last night? Theodrin was even-tempered, good-humored, patient. She said it could not be done in one session. Her own block had taken months to demolish, and she had finally realized she was channeling long before going to the tower. Still, failure hurt. And worst of all, if anyone ever discovered that she had cried like a baby in Theodrin's comforting arms when she knew she was failing. I heard you heaved Gareth Bryn's boots at his head when he told you to sit down and polish them properly. He still doesn't know Min does the polishing, does he? So he turned you upside down and... Swan's full-armed slap wrung her ears. For an instant she could only stare at the other woman, eyes going wider and wider. With a wordless shriek, she tried to punch Swan in the eye. Tried, because somehow Swan had tangled a fist in her hair. A moment later they were down in the dirt of the street, rolling about and screaming, flailing wildly. Grunting, Nynaeve thought she was getting the better of it, even if she did not know whether she was on the top or the bottom half the time. Swan was trying to yank her braid out by the roots with one hand, while the other pounded at her ribs or anything else it could find. But she had the woman the same way, and Swan's yanking and punching were definitely growing weaker, and she herself was going to pound Swan senseless in another minute, then snatch her bald. Nynaeve yelped as a toe caught her hard on the shin. The woman kicked. Nynaeve tried to knee her, but it was not easy in skirts. Kicking was not fighting fair. Suddenly, Nynaeve realized that Swan was shaking. At first, she thought the woman was crying. Then she realized it was laughter. Pushing herself up, she brushed strands of hair out of her face. Her braid was all but undone, and glared down at the other woman. What are you laughing at? Me? If you are... Not at you. At us. Still quivering with mirth, Swan shoved Nynaeve off her. Swan's hair was in wild disarray, and dust covered the plain wool dress she wore now, worn-looking and neatly darned in several places. She was barefoot, too. Two grown women, rolling around like... I haven't done that since I was 12, I think. I started thinking that all we needed would be Fat Cian snatching me up by an ear to tell me girls don't fight. I heard she once knocked down a drunken printer. I don't know why. Something very like giggles took her for a moment. Then she quieted them and stood, brushing dust from her clothes. If we have a disagreement, we can settle it like adult women. And in a careful tone, still, it might be a good idea not to discuss Gareth Bryn. She gave a start as the worn dress became a gown, red with black and gold embroidery around hem and swooping neckline. Nynaeve sat there staring at her. What would she have done as wisdom if she found two women rolling around in the dirt that way? If anything, the answer kept her anger at a simmer. Swan still did not seem to realize that there was no need to brush away dust with your hands in Tel Airradiod. Snatching away fingers that had been repairing her braid, Nynaeve got up quickly. Before she was on her feet again, her braid hung perfect over her shoulder, and her good Two Rivers woolens might have just been laundered. I agree, she said. She would have made any two women she caught like that sorry they had been born even before she had hauled them before the women's circle. What was she doing, lashing out with her fists like some fool man? First Sarandon. She did not want to think about that episode, but there it was. Then Latelle, and now this. Was she going to get around her block by being angry all the time? Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, that thought did nothing for her temper. If we have disagreements, we can discuss them. Which I suppose means we'll shout at one another, Swan said dryly. Well, better that than the other. We would not have to shout if you... Drawing a deep breath, Nynaeve jerked her eyes away. This was no way to begin anew. That breath caught in her throat, and she turned her head back to Swan so quickly it seemed she had been shaking it. She hoped it did. Just for an instant there had been a face in a window across the street, and there was a flutter in her belly, a bubble of fear, a burn of anger at being afraid. "I think we should go back now," she said quietly. "Go back? You said that vile concoction would put me to sleep for a good 2 hours, and we haven't been here much more than half that." "Time works differently here." Had it been Mogadine? The face had vanished so quickly it could have been someone dreaming herself here for an instant. If it was Mogadine, they must not on any account let her know she had been seen. They had to get away. Bubble of fear, burn of anger. "I told you, a day in Tel'aran Riyodh can be an hour in the waking world, or the other way round. I've dipped better out of the bilge in a bucket, girl. You needn't think you can get away with shortchanging me. You'll teach me everything you teach the others as agreed. We can go when I wake up." There was no time, if it had been Mogadine. Swan's dress was green silk now, and the Amerlin stole and her great serpent ring were back, but for a wonder the neckline was almost as low as anything she had worn before. The ring ter'angreal hung above her breasts, somehow part of a necklace of square emeralds. Nynaeve moved without thinking. Her hand lashed out, snatching the necklace so hard it tore free from Swan's neck. Swan's eyes widened, but as soon as the clasp broke, she vanished, and necklace and ring melted from Nynaeve's hand. For an instant she stared at her empty fingers. What happened to someone sent out of Tel'aran Riyodh like that? Had she sent Swan back to her sleeping body? Or to somewhere else? To nowhere? Panic seized her. She was just standing there. Quick as thought she fled, the world of dreams seeming to change around her. She stood on a dirt street in a small village of wooden houses, none more than a single story. The white lion of Andor waved from a tall staff, and a single stone dock stuck out into a broad river where a flock of long-billed birds flapped south low over the water. It all looked vaguely familiar, but it took her a moment to know where she was. Jureen, in Cairhien, and that river was the Aranon. It had been here that she and Egwene and Elaine had boarded the Darter, as badly misnamed as the river serpent, to continue their journey to Tyr. That time seemed like something read in a book long ago. Why had she jumped to Jureen? That was simple, and answered as soon as she thought of it. Jureen was the one place she knew well enough to leap to in Tel'aran Riyodh that she could be sure Mogadine did not know. They had been there for an hour before Mogadine knew she existed, and she was sure neither she nor Elaine had ever mentioned it again, in Tel'aran Riyodh or awake. But that left another question, the same one in a way. Why Jureen? Why not step out of the dream, wake up in her own bed, such as it was, if washing dishes and scrubbing floors on top of everything had not left her so weary she slept right on? I can still step out. Mogadine had seen her in Salidar, if that had been Mogadine. Mogadine knew Salidar now. I can tell Shiriam. How? Admit she was teaching Swan? She was not supposed to have her hands on those ter'angreal except with Shiriam and the other Aes Sedai. How Swan got hold of them when she wanted, Nynaeve did not know. No, she was not afraid of more hours up to her elbows in hot water. She was afraid of Mogadine. Anger burned in her belly fiercely. She wished she had some goose mint out of her scrip of herbs. I am so bloody tired of being afraid. There was a bench in front of one of the houses overlooking dock and river. She sat down and considered her situation from every angle. It was ridiculous. The true source was a pale thing. She channeled a flame dancing in air above her head. She might look solid, to herself anyway, but she could see the river through that scrap of fire. She tied it off, and it faded away like mist as soon as the knot was done. How could she face Mogadin when the weakest novice in Salidar could match or better her strength? That was why she had fled here instead of leaving Tel Aranriod. Afraid and angry at being afraid, too angry to think straight, to consider her own weakness. She would step out of the dream. Whatever Swan's scheme had been, it was done. She would have to take her chances right along with Nynaeve. The thought of more hours scrubbing floors tightened her hand on her braid. Days, more likely, and maybe Shiriam's switch besides. They might never let her near one of the dream ter'angreal again, or any ter'angreal. They would set Faerlane over her instead of Theodrin. A finish to studying Swan and Lyanna, much less Loghain. Maybe a finish to studying healing. In a fury, she channeled another flame. If it was a whit stronger, she could not see it. So much for trying to crank her anger in hope it would help. There's nothing for it but to just tell them I saw Mogadin, she muttered, yanking her braid hard enough to hurt. Light. They will give me to Faerlane. I'd almost rather die. But you seem to enjoy running little errands for her. That mocking voice pulled Nynaeve up off the bench like hands on her shoulders. Mogadin stood in the street all in black, shaking her head at what she saw. With all her strength, Nynaeve wove a shield of spirit and hurled it between the other woman and Saidar. Tried to hurl it between. It was like chopping at a tree with a paper hatchet. Mogadin actually smiled before she bothered to slice Nynaeve's weave, and that as casually as brushing a bite-me away from her face. Nynaeve stared at her as though poleaxed. After everything, it came down to this. The one power, useless. All the anger bubbling inside her, useless. All her plans, her hopes, useless. Mogadin did not bother to strike back. She did not even bother to channel a shield of her own. That was how much contempt she had. I was afraid you had seen me. I grew careless when you and Swan started trying to kill each other with your hands. Mogadin gave a belittling laugh. She was weaving something, lazily, because there was no reason to hurry. Nynaeve did not know what it was, yet she wanted to scream. Fury seethed inside her, but fear dulled her wits, rooted her feet to the ground. Sometimes I think you are all too ignorant even to train. You and the former Amerlin's seat and all the rest. But I cannot allow you to betray me. That weave was reaching out for her. It is time to collect you at last, it seems. Hold, Mogadin! Birgitte shouted. Nynaeve's mouth dropped open. It was Birgitte, as she had been, in her short white coat and wide yellow trousers, intricate golden braid pulled over her shoulder, silver arrow drawn on silver bow. It was impossible. Birgitte was no longer part of Tel Aranriod. She was back in Salidar, making sure no one discovered Nynaeve and Swan asleep with the sun up and began asking questions. Mogadin was so shocked, the flows she had woven vanished. Shock lasted less than a moment, though. The gleaming arrow flew from Birgitte's bow and evaporated. The bow evaporated. Something seemed to seize the archer, jerking her arms straight up, pulling her clear of the ground. Almost immediately she was snubbed short, pulled tight between wrists and ankles a foot above the ground. I should have considered the possibility of you. Mogadin turned her back on Nynaeve to move closer to Birgitte. Do you enjoy your flesh? Without Gadel Kane? Nynaeve thought of channeling. But what? A dagger that might not even penetrate the woman's skin? Fire that would not singe her skirts? Mogadin knew how useless she was. She was not even looking at her. If she stopped the flow of spirit to the sleeping woman in amber, she would wake in Salidar. She could give warning. Her face twisted near to tears as she looked at Birgitte. The golden-haired woman hung there, staring defiantly at Mogadin. Mogadin contemplated her in return as a woodcarver would a block of wood. There's only me, Nynaeve thought. I might as well not be able to channel at all. There's only me. Lifting that first foot was like pulling it out of knee-deep mud, the second staggering step no easier, toward Mogadine. "Don't hurt me," Nynaeve cried. "Please, don't hurt me." A chill ran through her. Birgitte was gone. A child of perhaps 3 or 4, in short white coat and wide yellow trousers, stood there playing with a toy-sized silver bow. Flipping her golden braid back, the child aimed the bow at Nynaeve and giggled, then stuck a finger in her mouth, as though unsure whether she had done something wrong. Nynaeve sagged to her knees. It was hard work crawling in skirts, but she did not think she could have remained standing. Somehow she managed, reaching out a pleading hand and whimpering, "Please, don't hurt me. Please, don't hurt me," over and over as she dragged toward the Forsaken, a broken beetle scrabbling in the dirt. Mogadine watched silently until at last she said, "Once I thought you were stronger than this. Now I find I truly like the sight of you on your knees. That is close enough, girl. Not that I think you have courage enough to try tearing my hair out." She seemed amused by the notion. Nynaeve's hand wavered a span from Mogadine. It had to be close enough. There was only her, and Tel'aran'rhiod. Rhiod. The image formed in her head, and there it was, silver bracelet on her outstretched wrist, silver leash linking it to the silver collar around Mogadine's neck. It was not just the eidam she fixed in her head, but Mogadine wearing it, Mogadine and the eidam, a part of Tel'aran'rhiod that she held in the form she wanted. She knew something of what to expect. She had worn an eidam's bracelet briefly once, in Falme. In a strange way, she was aware of Mogadine in the same way she was aware of her own body, her own emotions. 2 sets, each distinct, but each in her own head. One thing she had only hoped, because Elaine insisted it was so. The thing was indeed a link. She could feel the source through the other woman. Mogadine's hand leaped to the collar, shock rounding her eyes. Rage and horror. Rage more than horror at first. Nynaeve felt them almost as if they were her own. Mogadine had to know what the leash and collar was, yet she tried to channel anyway. At the same time, Nynaeve felt a slight shifting in herself, in the eidam, as the other woman tried to bend Tel'aran'rhiod to herself. Suppressing Mogadine's attempt was simple. The eidam was a link, with her in control. Knowing that made it easy. Nynaeve did not want to channel those flows, so they were not channeled. Mogadine might as well have tried to pick up a mountain with her bare hands. Horror overwhelmed rage. Getting to her feet, Nynaeve fastened the proper image in her mind. She did not just imagine Mogadine leashed in the eidam. She knew Mogadine was leashed, as firmly as she knew her own name. The sense of shifting, of her skin trying to crawl, did not go away, though. "Stop that," she said sharply. The eidam did not move, but it seemed to tremble unseen. She thought of black wasp nettles lightly brushing the other woman from shoulders to knees. Mogadine shuddered, exhaled convulsively. "Stop it," I said, "or I'll do worse." The shifting ceased. Mogadine watched her warily, still clutching the silver collar around her neck, and with an air of being poised on her toes for flight. Birgitte, the child who was, or had been Birgitte, stood eyeing them curiously. Nynaeve formed the image of her as a grown woman, concentrated. The little girl put her finger back in her mouth and began studying the toy bow. Nynaeve breathed angrily. It was hard changing what someone else was already maintaining, and on top of that, Mogadine had claimed she could make changes permanent, but what she could do, she could undo. Restore her. "If you release me, Nynaeve thought of nettles again, and not a light brush this time. Mogadine sucked air through clenched teeth, shook like a bedsheet in a high wind. "That," Birgitte said, "was the most frightening thing that has ever happened to me." Herself once more, she wore the short coat and wide trousers, but she had no bow or quiver. I was a child, but at the same time, what was me, really me, was just some fancy floating in the back of that child's mind. And I knew it. I knew I was just going to watch what happened and play. Flipping her golden braid back over her shoulder, she gave Mogadin a hard look. "How did you get here?" Nynaeve asked. "I am grateful, you understand, but how?" Birgitte gave Mogadin a final stony stare, then opened her coat to fish in the neck of her blouse, pulling up the twisted stone ring on a leather thong. Swan woke up, just for a moment, and not all the way. Long enough to grumble about you snatching this from her. When you didn't wake right behind her, I knew something must be wrong, so I took the ring and the last of what you mixed for Swan. There was hardly any left, only the dregs. Enough to put me to sleep. It tastes horrible, by the way. After that, it was as easy as finding feather dancers in Shiota. In some ways, this is almost as if I were still... Birgitte cut off with another glare for Mogadin. The silver bow reappeared in her hand, and a quiver of silver arrows at her hip, yet after one moment they vanished again. "Past is past, and the future is ahead," she said firmly. "I was not truly surprised to realize there were two of you who knew they were in Tel Ayran Rheod. I knew the other must be her, and when I arrived and saw the pair of you, it seemed as if she had already captured you, but I hoped that if I distracted her, you might come up with something." Nynaeve felt a stab of shame. She had considered abandoning Birgitte. That was what she had almost come up with. The thought had only been there for a moment, rejected as soon as it came, but it had come. What a coward she was. Surely Birgitte never had even moments when fear almost took control of her. A faint taste of boiled cat fern and powdered maven's leaf. "I almost ran away," she said faintly. "I was so frightened my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. I almost ran away and left you." "Oh?" Nynaeve writhed inside as Birgitte considered her. "But you did not, did you?" "I should have loosed before I called out, but I've never felt comfortable shooting anyone from behind, even her. Still, it all worked out. But what do we do with her now?" Mogadin certainly seemed to have overcome her fear. Ignoring the silver collar around her throat, she watched Nynaeve and Birgitte as though they were the prisoners, not she, and she was deliberating what to do with them. Except for an occasional twitch of her hands, as if she wanted to scratch where her skin held the memory of nettles, she appeared black-clad serenity. Only the Eidam let Nynaeve know there was fear in the woman, almost a gibbering, but pushed down to a muted buzz. She wished the thing let her know what Mogadin was thinking as well as feeling. Then again, she was just as glad not to be inside the mind behind those cold, dark eyes. "Before you consider anything drastic," Mogadin said, "remember that I know much that would be useful to you. I have observed the other chosen, peeked into their schemes. Is that not worth something?" "Tell me, and I will consider whether it's worth anything," Nynaeve said. What could she do with the woman? "Lanfear, Grendal, Ravine, and Samael are plotting together." Nynaeve gave the leash a short tug, staggering her. "I know that. Tell me something new." The woman was captive here, but the Eidam only existed so long as they were in Tel Ayran Rheod. "Do you know they are drawing Randall Thor
Hey,
to attack
Bastine, how you doing, bro?
But when he does, he will find the others
Give me
as
1
well,
second, bro, and we'll
waiting
do a
to
dab.
trap him between them. At least he will find Grendal and Ravine. I think Lanfear plays another game, one the others know nothing about." Nynaeve exchanged worried glances with Birgitte. Rand must learn of this. He would, as soon as she and Elaine could speak to Egwene tonight. If they could manage to put their hands on the ter'angreal long enough. "That is," Mogadin murmured, "if he lives long enough to find them." Nynaeve took hold of the silvery leash where it joined the collar, and pulled the Forsaken's face close to hers. Dark eyes met her gaze flatly, but she could feel anger through the Idam, and fear wriggling up and being stamped down. You listen to me. Do you think I don't know why you are pretending to be so cooperative? You think if you keep talking long enough, I will make some slip and you can escape. You think the longer we talk, the harder I'll find it to kill you. That much was true enough. To kill somebody in cold blood, even one of the Forsaken, would be hard. Maybe harder than she could manage.
I haven't been doing too
What
bad.
was she going to do with the woman? But you understand this. I won't allow hinting at things. If you try keeping anything back from me, I will do to you everything you
Got
ever
me
thought of doing to me.
A new little dabber.
Dread, creeping through the leash like bone-chilling shrieks deep in Moghedin's mind.
A Luca
Maybe
dragon
she did
egg.
not know as much about Idam as Nynaeve thought. Maybe she believed Nynaeve could read her thoughts if she tried. Now, if you know of some threat to Rand, something ahead of Samael and the others, you tell me. Now! Words spilled from Moghedin's
Good thing I
mouth,
have this,
and her
because
tongue flickered out to wet
my,
her lips continually.
Dr. Dabber, I gotta...
Althor means to go after
gotta
Ravine
charge up.
today, this morning, because he thinks Ravine killed Morghese. I don't know whether he did or not, but Althor believes it. But Ravine never trusted Lanfear. He never trusted any of them. Why should he? He thought it all might be some trap set for him, so he has laid a trap of his own. He has set wards through Caemlyn, so if a man channels a spark, he will know. Althor will walk right into it. He almost certainly already has. I think he meant to leave Cairhien right after sunrise. I had no part of it. It was none of my doing. Nynaeve wanted to shut her up. The fierce sweat glistening on the woman's face made her sick. But if she had to listen to that pleading voice, too. She started to channel, wondering whether she would be strong enough to hold Moghedin's tongue, then smiled. She was linked to Moghedin, and in control. Moghedin's eyes bulged as she wove flows to stop her own mouth and tied them. Nynaeve added plugs for her ears, too, before turning to Birgitte. What do you think? Elaine's heart will break. She loves her mother. I know that. Nynaeve took a breath. I will cry with her and mean every tear, but right now I must worry about Rand. I think she was telling the truth. I could almost feel it. She caught the silver leaf just below her bracelet and shook it. Maybe it's this, and maybe it was imagination. What do you believe? That it's the truth. She was never very brave unless she clearly had the upper hand, or thought she could get it. And you certainly put the fear of the light into her. Nynaeve grimaced. Birgitte's every word put another bubble of anger in her belly. She was never very brave, except when she clearly had the upper hand. That could describe herself. She had put the fear of the light into Moghedin. She had, and she meant every word when she said it. Boxing somebody's ears when they needed it was one thing. Threatening torture, wanting to torture, even Moghedin, was something else again. And here she was trying to avoid what she knew she had to do. Never very brave, except when she clearly had the upper hand. This time the bubble of anger was seeded by herself. We have to go to Caemlyn. I do, at least. With her. I may not be able to channel strongly enough to tear paper as I am, but with the Idam I can use her strength. You won't be able to affect anything in the waking world from Tel'aran'rhiod, Birgitte said quietly. I know, but I have to do something. Birgitte threw back her head and laughed. Oh, Nynaeve, it is such an embarrassment being associated with such a coward as you. Abruptly, her eyes widened in surprise. There wasn't much of your potion left. I think I am wake. During the mid-word, she was simply no longer there. Taking a deep breath, Nynaeve untied the flows around Moghedin, or made her do it. With the Idam, it was hard to tell which, really. She wished Birgitte was still there, another pair of eyes. Someone who probably knew Tel'aran'rhiod better than she ever could. Someone who was brave. We are taking a trip, Mogadin, and you are going to help me with every last scrap of you. If anything takes me by surprise, suffice it to say, anything that happens to the one wearing this bracelet happens to the one wearing the collar, only about tenfold. The sickly look on Mogadin's face said she believed, and it was just as well, since it was true. Another deep breath, and Nynaeve began forming the image of the one place in Caemlyn she knew well enough to remember, the royal palace where Elaine had taken her. Ravine must be there, but in the waking world, not the world of dreams. Still, she had to do something. Tel'aran'rhiod Rhiod changed around her.
Chapter 55. The threads burn. Rand stopped. A long scorch along the corridor wall marked where half a dozen costly tapestries had gone to ash. Flames licked upward on another. A number of inlaid chests and tables were only charred ruins. Not his work. 30 paces further on, red-coated men in breastplates and helmets with barred face guards lay contorted in death on the white floor tiles, useless swords in hand. Not his work either.
It definitely hits pretty good.
Ravin had been wasteful of his own in attempting to reach Rand. He had been clever in his attacks, clever in his escapes. But from the moment he fled the throne room, he had not faced Rand for more than the instant it took to strike and flee. Ravin was strong, perhaps as strong as Rand, and more knowledgeable. But Rand had the fat little man Ungrial in his pocket, and Ravin had none. The corridor was doubly familiar, once for having seen it before, once for having seen something similar. I walked this way with Elaine and Gawain the day I met Morghese. The folk slithered painfully along the boundaries of the void. He was cold in there, without emotion. saidin raged and burned, but he was icy calm. And another thought, like a stab. She lay on a floor like this, her golden hair spread as though sleeping. Ilyena Sunhair. My Ilyena. Elaida had been there that day, too. She foretold the pain I'd bring. She knew the darkness in me. Some of it. Enough.
Ilyena, I did not know what I was doing. I was mad. I was mad. Oh, Ilyena.
Elaida knew. Some. But she did not tell even all of that. Better if she had told.
Oh, Light, is there no forgiveness? I did what I did in madness. Is there no mercy?
Gareth Bryn would have killed me had he known. Morghese would have ordered my death. Morghese would be alive, perhaps. Elaine's mother alive. Aviendha alive. Mat, Moraine. How many alive, if I had died?
I have earned my torment.
I deserve the final death.
Oh, Ilyena, I deserve death.
I deserve death. Bootsteps behind him. He turned. They came out of a broad crossing corridor, not 20 paces from him. 24 men in breastplates and helmets, and the white-collared redcoats of the Queen's guards. Except that Andor had no queen now, and these men had not served her while she lived. A Myrddraal led them, pale eyeless face like something found under a rock, overlapping plates of black armor heightening the illusion of a serpent as it moved, black cloak hanging motionless however it moved. The look of the eyeless was fear, but fear was a distant thing in the void. They hesitated when they saw him. Then the half-man raised its black-bladed sword. Men who had not already drawn put hands to hilts. Rand, he thought that was his name, channeled in a way he could not remember doing before. Men in Myrddraal stiffened where they stood. White frost grew thick on them, frost that smoked as Mat's boots had smoked. The Myrddraal's upraised arm broke off with a loud crack. When it hit the floor tiles, arm and sword shattered. Rand could feel the cold. Yes, that was his name, Rand. Cold like a knife, as he walked past and turned the way they had come. Cold, yet warmer than Saidin. A man and a woman crouched against the wall, servants liveried in red and white, short of their middle years, and holding each other as though for protection. Seeing Rand, there was more to the name, not just Rand. The man started to rise from where he had huddled away from the Myrddraal-led band, but the woman hauled him back by his sleeve. "Go in peace," Rand said, putting out a hand. "althor. Yes, Rand althor. I'll not hurt you, but you could be hurt if you stay." The woman's brown eyes rolled up in her head. She would have collapsed in a heap if the man had not caught her, and his narrow mouth was working rapidly, as if he was praying but could not get the words out. Rand looked where the man was looking. His hand had stretched out of his coat sleeve far enough to bear the dragon's golden-maned head that was part of his skin. "I will not hurt you," he said, and walked on, leaving them there. He had
How's
Ravin
everyone's
to corner
evening
yet.
going?
Ravin to kill. And then... no sound but the click of his boots on the tiles, and deep in his head a faint voice murmuring mournfully of Ilyena and forgiveness. He strained to feel Ravin channeling, to feel the man filled with the true source. Nothing. Saidin seared his bones, froze his flesh, scoured his soul, but from without it was not easy to see until you were close. A lion in high grass, Asmodean had said once. A rabid lion. Should Asmodean count among those who should not have died? Or Lanfear? No, not. He had only a moment's warning to throw himself flat. A hair-thin slice of time between feeling flows suddenly woven and an arm-thick bar of white light, liquid fire, slicing through the wall, ripping across like a sword, through where his chest had been. Where that bar slashed, on both sides of the hallways, wall and friezes, doors and tapestries ceased to exist. Severed wall hangings and chunks of stone and plaster, broken free, rained to the floor. So much for the Forsaken fearing to use balefire. Who had told him that? Moraine. She surely had deserved to live. Balefire leaped from his hands, a brilliant white shaft streaking toward where that other bar had originated. The other failed, even as his punched through the wall, leaving a purple afterimage fanning across his vision. He reversed his own flow. Had he done it finally? Scrambling to his feet, he channeled air, slamming ruined doors so hard that remnants ripped from the hinges. Inside, the room was empty. A sitting room, with chairs arrayed before a great marble fireplace. His balefire had taken a bite out of one of the arches leading to a small courtyard with a fountain, and another from one of the fluted columns along the walk beyond. Ravin had not gone that way, though, and he had not died in that blast of balefire. A residue hung in the air, a fading remnant of woven Saidin. Rand recognized it. Different from the gateway he had made to skim to Caemlyn, or the one to travel, he knew now that was what he had done, into the throne room. But he had seen one like this in Tyr, had made one himself. He wove another now. A gateway, an opening at least, a hole in reality. It was not blackness on the other side. In fact, if he had not known the way was there, if he could not have seen the weave of it, he might not have known. There before him were the same arches opening onto the same courtyard and fountain, the same columned walk. For an instant, the neatly rounded holes his balefire had made in arch and column wavered, filled, then were holes again. Wherever that gateway led, it was to somewhere else, a reflection of the royal palace as once it had been a reflection of the Stone of Tyr. Vaguely, he regretted not talking to Asmodean about it while he had the chance. But he had never been able to speak of that day to anyone. It did not matter. On that day, he had carried Collindor, but the Angreal in his pocket had already proved enough to harry Ravin. Stepping through quickly, he loosed the weave and hurried away across the courtyard as the gateway vanished. Ravin would have felt that gate if he was close enough and trying. The fat little stone man did not mean he could stand and wait to be attacked. No sign of life, except for himself and one fly. That was the way it had been in Tyr, too. Stand lamps in hallways stood unlit, with pale wicks that had never seen a flame. Yet, even in what should have been the dimmest hall, there was light, seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere. Sometimes those lamps moved, too, and other things as well. Between one glance and the next, a tall lamp might have moved a foot, a vase in a niche an inch. Little things, as if someone had shifted them in the time his eyes were away. Wherever this was, it was a strange place. It came to him, as he trotted along another colonnade, sensing for Ravin, that he had not heard the voice crying over Ilyena since he channeled balefire. Perhaps he had somehow chased Lews Therin out of his head. Good. He stopped at the edge of one of the palace gardens. The roses and white star bushes looked as drought-bedraggled as they would have in the real palace. On some of the white spires rising above the rooftops, the white lion banner rippled. But which spire could change in the blink of an eye? Good. If I don't have to share my head with. He felt odd, insubstantial. He raised his arm and stared. He could see the garden through coat sleeve and arm as though through a mist that was thinning. When he glanced down, he could see the walk's paving stones through himself. No! It was not his thought. An image began to coalesce. A tall, dark-eyed man with a worry-creased face and more white in his hair than brown. I am Lews Therin. I am Randall Thor, Rand broke in. He did not know what was happening, but the faint dragon was beginning to fade from the misty arm held in front of his face. The arm began to look darker, the fingers on his hand longer. I am me. That echoed in the void. I am Randall Thor. He fought to picture himself in his own mind, struggled to make the image of what he saw in the mirror every day shaving, what he saw in a stand mirror dressing. It was a frantic fight. He had never really looked at himself. The two images waxed and waned, the older dark-eyed man and the younger with blue-gray eyes. Slowly the younger image firmed, the older faded. Slowly his arm grew more solid. His arm, with the dragon twined round it, and the heron branded into his palm. There had been times he hated those marks, but now, even enclosed within the emotionless void, he almost grinned to see them. Why had Lews Therin tried to take him over? To make him into Lews Therin? He was sure that was who that dark-eyed man with the suffering face had been. Why now? Because he could in this place, whatever it was? Wait. It had been Lews Therin who shouted that adamant no. Not an attack by Lews Therin. By Ravin, and not using the power. If the man had been able to do this back in Caemlyn, the real Caemlyn, he would have. It had to be some ability he had gained here. And if Ravin had gained it, perhaps he had too. The image of himself had been what held him, brought him back. He focused on the nearest rose bush, a thing a span high, and imagined it growing thin, foggy. Obediently, it melted away to nothing. But as soon as the picture in his mind was nothing, the rosebush was suddenly back, just as it had been. Rand nodded coldly. It had limits. There were always limits and rules, and he did not know them here. But he knew the power, as much as Asmodean had taught him, and he had taught himself. And Saladin was still in him, all the sweetness of life, all the corruption of death. Ravin had to have seen him to attack. With the power, you had to see something to affect it, or know exactly where it was in relation to you, down to a hair. Perhaps it was different here, but he did not think so. He almost wished Lews Therin had not gone silent again. The man might know this place and its rules. Balconies and windows overlooked the garden, in some places 4 stories high. Raven had tried to unmake him. He drew on the raging torrent of Saidin through the Ungrial. Lightnings flashed from the sky. 100 forking silver bolts, more, stabbing at every window, every balcony. Thunder filled the garden, erupting chunks of stone. The air itself crackled, and the hair on his arms and chest tried to stand under his shirt. Even the hair on his head began to lift. He let the lightnings die. Here and there, bits of shattered stone window frame and balcony broke loose. The crash of their fall muted by the echoes of thunder still ringing in his ears. Gaping holes peered down now where windows had. They looked like sockets in some monstrous skull. The ruined balconies like a dozen splintered mouths. If Raven had been at any of them, he was surely dead. Rand would not believe it until he saw the corpse. He wanted to see Raven dead. Wearing a snarl he did not know was there, he stalked back into the palace. He had wanted to see Raven die.
Nynaeve hurled herself flat and scrambled along the hall floor as something slashed through the nearest wall. Mogadine slithered as fast as she, but if the woman had not, she would have hauled her by the eidam. Had that been Rand or Ravine? She had seen bars of white fire, liquid light, like that in Tanchico, and she had no wish to be anywhere near one again. She did not know what it was, and she did not want to know. I want to heal, burn both of these fool men, not learn a fancy way to kill. She levered herself up to a crouch, peered back the way they had come. Nothing. An empty palace hallway, with a 10-foot-long gash through both walls, as neat as any stoneworker could have done, and bits of tapestry lying on the floor. No sign of either man. She had not had a glimpse of either so far, only their handiwork. Sometimes that handiwork had almost been her. A good thing that she could draw on Mogadine's anger, filter it out of the terror clawing to escape, and let it seep into her. Her own was a pitiful thing that would scarcely have allowed her to sense the true source, much less channel the flow of spirit that kept her in Tel'aran'rhiod. Rhiod. Mogadine was hunched over on her knees, dry retching. Nynaeve's mouth tightened. The woman had tried to remove the eidam again. Her cooperation had faded quickly when they discovered Rand and Ravin actually here in Tel'aran'rhiod. Well, trying to unfasten that collar when it was around your neck was its own punishment. At least Mogadine did not have anything left in her stomach this time. Please, Mogadine caught at Nynaeve's skirt. I tell you we must get away. Stark panic made her voice painful. Mogadine's clawing terror mirrored itself on her face. They are here in the flesh. The flesh. Be quiet, Nynaeve said absently. Unless you've lied to me, that is an advantage. For me. The other woman claimed that being in the world of dreams physically limited your control of the dream. Or rather, she admitted it, after letting a bit of the knowledge slip. She had admitted, too, that Ravin did not know Tel'aran'rhiod as well as she. Nynaeve hoped that meant he did not know it as well as she did. That he knew more than Rand, she did not doubt. That wool-headed man. Whatever his reason for coming after Ravin, he should never have let the man lead him here, where he did not know the rules, where thoughts could kill. Why will you not understand what I tell you? Even if they had only dreamed themselves here, either would be stronger than we. Here in the flesh they could crush us without blinking. In the flesh they can draw Saidin more deeply than we can draw Saidar dreaming. We are linked. Still not paying attention, Nynaeve gave her braid a sharp pull. No way to tell which direction they had gone, and no warning of anything until she saw them. Somehow it still seemed unfair that they could channel without her being able to see or feel the flows. A stand lamp that had been sliced in two was suddenly whole again, then not, just as quickly. That white fire must be incredibly powerful. Tel'aran'rhiod usually healed itself rapidly, whatever you did to it. You brainless fool, Mogadine sobbed, shaking Nynaeve's skirt with both hands as if wanting to shake Nynaeve. It does not matter how brave you are. We are linked. But you contribute nothing the way you are. Not a shred. It is my strength and your madness. They are here in the flesh, not dreaming. They are using things you have never dreamed of. They will destroy us if we stay. Keep your voice down, Nynaeve snapped. Do you want to bring one of them down on us? She looked both ways hurriedly, but the hallway was still empty. Had that been footsteps? Boots? Rand? Or Ravin? One had to be approached as carefully as the other. A man in a fight for his life could strike out before he saw they were friends. Well, that she was, anyway. We must go, Mogadine insisted, but she did lower her voice. She got to her feet, sullen defiance twisting her mouth. Fear and anger writhed inside her, first one stronger than the other. Why should I help you any further? This is madness. Would you rather feel the nettles again? Mogadine flinched, yet her dark eyes remained stubborn. You think I will let them kill me rather than be hurt by you? You are mad. I will not stir from this spot until you are ready to take us away from here. Nynaeve jerked her braid again. If Mogadine refused to walk, she would have to drag her. Not a very quick way to search, with what seemed miles of palace corridors yet to go. She should have been harsher when the woman first tried balking. In Nynaeve's place, Mogadine would have killed without hesitation, or, if she thought the other useful, woven the trick of taking someone's will, making them worship her. Nynaeve had tasted that once in Tanchico, and even had she known how it was done, she did not think she could do it to somebody else. She despised this woman, hated her with all her being, but even if she had not needed her, she could not have killed her just standing there. The trouble was, she was afraid that Mogadine knew that too now. Still, a wisdom headed the women's circle, even if the circle did not always agree, and the women's circle dealt out punishments to women who broke the law or offended custom too deeply, and to men too for some transgressions. She might not have Mogadine's stomach for killing, for crushing people's minds, but... Mogadine opened her mouth, and Nynaeve filled it with a gasp of air. Or rather, she made Mogadine do it. With the Idam linking them, it was like channeling herself, but Mogadine knew it was her own abilities being used like a tool in Nynaeve's hand. Dark eyes glittered indignantly as Mogadine's own flows snared her arms to her sides and pulled her skirts tight around her ankles. For the rest, Nynaeve used the Idam, just as with the nettles, creating the sensations she wanted the other woman to feel. Not the reality, the feel of reality. Mogadine stiffened in her bonds as a leather strap seemed to strike her bottom. That was what it would feel like to her. Outrage and humiliation rolled through the leash, and contempt. Compared to her elaborate ways of hurting people, this seemed suitable for a child. When you are ready to cooperate again, Nynaeve said, just nod. This could not take long. She could not just stand there while Rand and Ravin tried to kill one another. If the wrong one died because she avoided danger by letting Mogadine keep her there. Nynaeve remembered a day when she was 16, just after she had been judged old enough to put her hair in a braid. She had stolen a plum pudding from Corin Ayelin on a dare from Neela Thane, and walked out the kitchen door right into Mistress Ayelin. Adding the aftermath, sending it along the leash in a lump, made Mogadine's eyes pop. Grimly, Nynaeve did it again. She won't stop me short. Again. I will help Rand whatever she thinks. Again. Even if it kills us. Again. Oh, Light, she could be right. Rand could kill us both before he knows it's me. Again. Light, I hate being afraid. Again. I hate her. Again. I hate her. Again. Abruptly, she realized Mogadine was jerking frantically in her bonds, nodding her head so violently it seemed about to come off. For a moment, Nynaeve gaped at the other woman's tear-streaked face, then stopped what she was doing and hurriedly unraveled the flows of air. Light! What had she done? She was not Mogadine. I take it you won't give me any more trouble? They will kill us, the other woman mumbled faintly, and nearly unintelligibly through her sobs, but at the same time she nodded a hurried acquiescence. Deliberately, Nynaeve hardened herself. Mogadine deserved everything she had gotten and much, much more. In the tower, one of the Forsaken would have been stilled and executed as soon as the trial could be concluded, and little evidence needed beside who she was. Good. Now Thunder shook the entire palace, or something very much like thunder, except that the walls rattled and dust rose off the floor. Nynaeve half fell into Mogadine, and they danced, trying to keep their feet. Before the upheaval had faded completely, it was replaced by a roar like some monstrous fire racing up a chimney the size of a mountain. That lasted only a moment. The silence after seemed deeper than before. No, there were boots. A man running. The sound echoed down the hallway. From the north. Nynaeve pushed the other woman away. "Come on." Mogadine whimpered, but did not resist being pulled down the hall. Her eyes were huge, though, and her breath came too fast. Nynaeve thought it was a good thing she had Mogadine along, and not just for access to the One Power. After all her years hiding in shadows, the spider was such a coward she almost made Nynaeve feel brave by comparison. Almost. It was only anger at her own fear that made her able to hold on to that one flow of spirit that kept her in Tel Aran'rhiod now. Mogadine was stark terror to her bones. Pulling Mogadine behind her by the gleaming leash, Nynaeve quickened her step, chasing the fading sound of those other steps.
Rand stepped into the round courtyard warily. Half of the white-paved circle cut into the structure, rising 3 stories behind him. The other half was bounded by a stone semicircle atop pale columns 5 paces high, sticking out into yet another garden, shaded gravel walks beneath low-spreading trees. Marble benches surrounded a pool with lily pads, and fish, gold and white and red. Suddenly the benches shifted, flowed, changed into faceless man-shapes, still as white and hard-looking as the stone. He had already learned the difficulty of changing something that Ravin had altered. Lightning danced from his fingertips, shattering stone men to shards. The air became water. Choking, Rand struggled to swim toward the columns. He could see the garden beyond. There must be some kind of barrier to stop all the water pouring out. Before he could channel, gold and red and white shapes were darting around him, larger than the fish in the pool had been, and with teeth. They ripped at him. Blood curled up in red mist. Instinctively, he flailed at the fish with his hands, but the cold part of him, deep in the void, channeled. Balefire flared, at the barrier if there was one, at any place Ravin might be to see this courtyard. The water roiled, throwing him around violently as it rushed in to fill the empty tunnels carved by balefire. Flickers of gold and white and red darted at him, adding new threads of crimson to the water. Tossed about, he could not see to aim his wild bolts. They flashed in every direction. No breath left. He tried to think of air, or the water being air. Suddenly it was. He dropped hard to the paving stones, among small fish flopping about, rolled over and pushed himself up. It was all air again. Even his clothes were dry. The stone ring flickered between standing untouched and lying in ruins with half the columns down. Some of the trees lay tangled atop their own stumps, then stood whole, then were fallen again. The palace behind him had holes punched in white walls, even one through a high gilded dome above, and gashes slashed across windows, some with piercework stone screens. The damage all flickered, vanishing and reappearing. Not the slow, sometime shifts of before, but constant. Damage, then none, then some, then none, then all again. Wincing, he pressed his hand to his side, to the old half-healed wound. It stung as if his exertions had nearly torn it open. He stung all over from a dozen or more bleeding bites. That had not changed. The bloody rips in his coat and breeches were still there. Had he managed to change the water back to air? Or had one of his frenzied bolts of balefire driven Ravin off, or even killed him? it did not matter unless it was the last. Wiping blood out of his eyes, he studied the windows and balconies around the garden, the colonnade high on the far side. Or rather, he started to, but something else caught his eye. Below the colonnade, he could just make out the fading remnants of a weave. From there, he could tell it was a gateway. But to see what kind and where it led, he had to be closer. Leaping over a jumble of worked stone that vanished while he was above it, he darted across the garden, dodging around trees fallen on the walkway. That residue was almost gone. He had to get close enough before it vanished completely. Abruptly he fell, gravel scraping his palms as he caught himself. He could not see anything that might have tripped him. He felt woozy, almost as if he had been hit on the head. He tried to scramble to his feet to reach that residue, and realized his body was writhing. Long hair covered his hands. His fingers seemed to be shrinking, drawing back into his hands. They were almost paws. A trap. Ravin had not fled. The gateway had been a trap, and he had walked into it. Desperation clung to the void as he struggled to cling to himself. His hands. They were hands. Almost hands. He forced himself up. His legs seemed to bend wrong. The true source receded. The void shrank. Streaks of panic flared beyond the emotionless emptiness. Whatever Ravin was trying to change him to, it could not channel. Saidin slipping away, thinning. Thin, even pulled through the Angreal. The surrounding balconies stared down at him, empty, and the colonnade. Ravin had to be at one of those stone-screened windows, but which? He had no strength for 100 lightning bolts this time. One burst. He could manage that, if he did it quickly. Which window? He fought to be himself, fought to draw Saidin into him, welcomed every stain of the taint as evidence that he still held the power. Staggering in a crooked circle, searching vainly, he roared Ravin's name. It sounded like a beast's roar.
Pulling Mogadin behind her, Nynaeve rounded the corner. Ahead of her, a man vanished around the next turning, the sound of his boots echoing behind. She did not know how long she'd been following those boots. Sometimes they had gone silent, and she'd had to wait for them to start again to gain a direction. Sometimes when they stopped, things happened. She had not seen any of it, but once the palace had rung like a struck bell, and another time the hair on her head had tried to stand up as the air seemed to crackle, and another. It did not matter. This was the first time she had caught a glimpse of the man who wore those boots. She did not think it was Rand in that black coat. The height was right, but he was too large, too heavy in the chest. She was running before she knew it. Her stout shoes had long since become velvet slippers for silence. If she could hear him, he could hear her. Mogadin's frenzied panting was louder than their footfalls. Nynaeve reached the turn and stopped, peeking cautiously around the corner. She held Saidar, through Mogadin, but it was hers, ready to channel. There was no need. The hallway was empty. A door stood far down a wall with windows filled with arabesque-pierced stone, but she did not think he could have reached that. Nearer, another corridor ran off to the right. She hurried to that, looked warily again. Empty. But a staircase spiraled upward just beyond where the hallways met. For a moment she hesitated. He had been hurrying somewhere. This corridor led back the way they had come. Would he have been running to go back? Up, then. Drawing Mogadin behind her, she climbed the steps slowly, straining to hear anything except the Forsaken's nearly hysterical breath and the blood pounding in her own ears. If she found herself face to face with him, she knew he was there already, somewhere ahead. Surprise had to be on her side. At the first landing, she paused. The hallways here mirrored those below. They were just as empty, too, just as silent. Had he gone on up? The stair quivered faintly beneath her feet, as if the palace had been struck by a huge battering ram, then another. Again, as a bar of white fire punched through the top of one of the stone-screened windows, skewed wildly upward at an angle, then winked out as it started to slice into the ceiling. Nynaeve swallowed, blinking in a vain effort to rid herself of the pale violet fan that hung across her vision in memory of the thing. That had to be Rand, trying to strike at Ravin. If she was too close to him, Rand might catch her by accident. If he was flailing like that, it had had the look of flailing to her. He could catch her anywhere without knowing it. The quivers had ceased. Moghedin's eyes shone with terror. By what Nynaeve felt through the eye-dom, it was a wonder the woman was not writhing on the floor, shrieking and frothing at the mouth. Nynaeve felt a little like shrieking herself. She made herself put her foot on the next step. Up was as good a way as any. The second step was almost as hard. Slowly, though. No need to come on him too suddenly. Surprise had to be on his part. Moghedin followed like a whipped doll, as much as she could have embraced had she been channeling on her own. She and Moghedin were much the same strength in the power. Tanchico had proved that. Was it enough? Moghedin insisted the men were stronger. Ravin, at least. Moghedin knew him. And it did not seem likely Rand could have survived this long unless he was just as strong. It was not fair that men should have the muscles and greater strength and the power, too. The Aes Sedai in the tower had always said they had been equal. It just was not... She was babbling. Taking a deep breath, she drew Moghedin behind her off the staircase. This was as high as it went. The hall was empty. She went to where it met the crossing corridor, peeked, and there he was. A tall, black-clad man, large, with wings of white in his dark hair, peering through the curving slots of one of the stone window screens at something below. There was sweat and effort on his face, but he seemed to be smiling. A handsome face, as handsome as Galad's, but she felt no quickening of her breath for this one. Whatever he was staring at, Rand, perhaps, had his full attention, but Nynaeve gave him no chance to notice her. It might be Rand down there. She could not tell whether Ravin was channeling or not. She filled the corridor around him with fire from wall to wall, floor to ceiling, pouring into it all of saidar she held, fire so hot the stone itself smoked. The heat made her flinch back. Ravin screamed in the middle of the flame. It was one flame, and staggered away from her, back to where the hallway became a columned walk. A heartbeat, less, while she still flinched, and he stood inside the flame but surrounded by clear air. Every scrap of saidar she could channel was going into that inferno, but he held it at bay. She could see him through the fire. It gave everything a red cast, but she could see. Smoke rose from his charred coat. His face was a seared ruin, one eye milky white, but both eyes were malevolent as he turned them on her. No emotion reached her along the eye-dom's leash, only leaden dullness. Nynaeve's stomach fluttered. Moghedin had given up. Given up, because death was there for them.
Fire thrust through the carved window screens above Rand, fingers of it filling every hole, dancing toward the colonnade. As it did, the struggle within him ceased abruptly. He was himself so suddenly it was almost a shock. He had been drawing desperately at saidin, trying to hold on to some of it. Now it rushed into him, an avalanche of fire and ice that made his knees buckle, made the void tremble with pain that shaved at it like a lathe. And Ravin stumbled backwards out onto the colonnade, face turned to something inside. Ravin wreathed in fire, yet somehow standing as though untouched. If untouched now, it had not been so before. Only the size of the figure, the impossibility of it being anyone else, told Rand it was him. The Forsaken was a figure of char and cracked red flesh that would have strained any healer to mend. The agony of it must have been overwhelming, except that Ravin would be inside the void within that burned remnant of a man, wrapped in emptiness where the body's pain was distant, and saidin close at hand. saidin raged inside Rand, and he loosed it all, not to heal.
Hell yeah, just chilling. Caught me just as I was about to end it. Alright, everyone. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone will continue to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe.